Because if you just read a parable at the top glance, it doesn't seem to make much sense. Or we're going to have to take some effort to try to understand specifically what that parable, what that story is fiction, what that parable that Jesus is trying to teach really means. Because it's just not on the surface. Some will even say it's not low-hanging fruit so we can grab it. We're going to have to work to grab what it is that Jesus is trying to say in this parable. In fact, Jesus says that he reveals the truth through parables to some. But the other purpose of parables is to also conceal the truth to some. That's some mystery parables that we're going to jump into now. Open your Bible, Matthew chapter 13. Let's get into this. Before we fully understand Matthew 13, as we always do, there's a whole bunch of context here. The first three words in Matthew chapter 13 says, that same day. That same day. If we're going to fully understand what Jesus is teaching, if we're going to fully understand what's going on, we need to understand what that same day means. What that same day refers to the chapter prior to this. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus goes after the Pharisees. Jesus goes after the Pharisees. This is up to this point in the Gospels, up to this point in Jesus' ministry, he's still in Galilee. He hasn't yet quite started the full journey towards Jerusalem yet. And what do we know about Jerusalem? We know that Jerusalem is Jesus' destiny towards death. We know that Jesus has a destiny in Jerusalem, ultimately with the cross, that's going to bring him to death. Ultimately, then he'll rise, and so we'll understand even furthermore, post-resurrection, post-ascension, what the vast majority of these parables even mean. But for here, Jesus begins, still in Galilee, he really sinks his teeth into the Pharisees. What's going on, and we don't have time to read it, what's going on in Matthew chapter 12 is he's calling the Pharisees out. What happens is, essentially Jesus does some healing, and Jesus does some ministry on the Sabbath. Now, what do we know about the Sabbath? We know one of the Ten Commandments was to keep the Sabbath holy. It was the understanding that the Old Levitical law in the Old Testament, we talked about the law at great length. Go listen to Philippians on our podcast if you want to hear that in even further length and further detail. But we know that it was against the Levitical law, against the Mosaic law, to do anything on the Sabbath. Specifically, they believed the Sabbath was on a Sunday. Specifically. And so Jesus does some ministry on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees try to call Jesus out. They're already anti-Jesus. They already have called Jesus demon-possessed. They've already called him a blasphemer. They've already called him a son of Beelzebub, a son of the devil, a son of Satan, essentially. They're already anti-Jesus. And so they try to trip Jesus up here, and Jesus calls them out. What he says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Verse 4 of chapter 12. He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. What he's saying here is, didn't you know that David, when there was somebody who needed to eat, when there was somebody who was hungry and starving, what did David do? He brought him in to the temple, he brought him in, and they ate the communion bread. They ate the bread that was reserved for the priests to serve at communion because they were starving. And what did Jesus say? He goes on to say, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Verse 5. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple could desecrate the day and are yet innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. So Jesus again announcing himself. Because what do we know about the Pharisees? We knew they knew what they needed to know about the Messiah. They knew everything about Jesus. They knew everything about what it meant to stay pure and to stay holy. In fact, that was their job. They were given the responsibility to keep Israel holy for the day the Messiah comes back. Unfortunately, they missed the Messiah. I tell you that the one greater than the temple is here. The one you've been waiting for thousands of years. The one that was first foreshadowed to you when you were rescued out of Egypt as slaves. He is here in front of you. Verse 7. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is consistently calling out the Pharisees, calling them out, calling them out, calling them out. They're not over yet, and they still try to call them out. It continues, it goes on further. Verse 24, Jesus says, it says, but when the Pharisees heard this, they said, it is only Beelzebub, the prince of the demons, that this fellow drives out demons. They continue to call Jesus out. Jesus then, from 25 through 37, calls them out. We'll pick it up in verse 33. Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. Verse 34, Jesus says, you brood of vipers. This isn't the first time we see this. We also know that John the Baptist, early in the Gospels, also calls out the Pharisees who showed up at a time that John the Baptist was doing baptisms. And they showed up, and they didn't show up to be baptized. They showed up to criticize. They showed up to explore, to make sure that what was going on, this sort of ruckus that was being created in the desert from this man, John the Baptist, was actually what it was meant to be. And so Jesus calls them a brood of vipers. This is strong language. Some may argue, listen, don't hear what I'm not saying. Some may argue contextually that this is the equivalent or just as strong as a modern day cuss word. Now don't hear what I'm not saying. This doesn't mean that Jesus is cussing, okay? This isn't giving license to flippantly use language. What I'm saying is the language here is strong, and Jesus intentionally picks this language out to call out the Pharisees. Now, what is a brood of vipers? This is literal. As much as it's figurative, it is also, he's calling them a venomous snake. The Pharisees were ones that would sink their fangs, so to speak, into people and would just instill venom into their lives. The Pharisees were consistently trying to disrupt. They were consistently trying to be subversive. And not even subterranean, but on the surface and broad day for everybody to see, to counteract the ministry of Jesus. And Jesus calls them out. How can you, who are evil, say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him. And the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. This is a dicey day. This specific day, like most days, Jesus had another altercation with the Pharisees. So on that same day, pick it up in chapter 13, after having to call out the Pharisees, after again having to show the Pharisees that they just continually miss it, on that same day, Jesus went out to the house, and sat by the lake. Now, for me, this would appear as, this has been a long day. It would appear as though, I'm not trying to read something into the text, it would appear as though that potentially Jesus may be a little winded, maybe a little tired. And so he kind of goes out to a house by the lake and he just goes to sit down for a moment. Verse 2, such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while the people stood on the shore. Jesus, on that same day, a whole bunch of stuff is going on. A whole bunch of people attacking Jesus. By the way, by this time, they're already plotting against the death of Jesus. They're already trying to kill Jesus. This is a long day, by any stretch of the imagination. So Jesus goes to sit down real quick, and before you know it, large crowds of people are already gathering around Jesus. This is something incredible. There's a nuance here that if we just read over this, we miss this. This isn't Jesus got up. He was sitting down by the lake at his house, and he gets up, and he gets into a boat, and the boat sets out just a little bit from shore. This is a great character into God. This is a great moment that Jesus gives us a picture of the heart of God. Jesus, Eugene Peterson writes here, he says that Jesus, the unhurried Jesus, and the continually interruptible Jesus. Jesus is continually interrupted He continually goes off by himself. And continually the crowds just follow him. They gather. And it says specifically that large crowds. Jesus was always willing to be interrupted. He was always unheard.